Chapter 7 Exile. The path was broad and clear, with no impinging magic. Only one thing chilled Bink, a region with small worm-like holes in the trunks of trees and surrounding rocks. Holes that wiggled straight through from one side to another. The Wiggles had been here. But he calmed himself. The Wiggles had not passed recently, of course. That menace had been abolished. But where they had infested, it was horrible, for the little flying worms had drilled magically through anything that got in their way, including animals and people. A tree could survive a few neat holes, but a person could bleed to death, assuming he did not die outright from the holing of some vital organ. The mere thought made Bink wince. He hoped the Wiggles never spawned again in Xanth, but there was no certainty about that. There was no certainty about anything where magic was involved. He walked faster, made nervous by the old wiggle scars. In half an hour, Bink reached the chasm, and there, sure enough, was the impossible bridge the good magician had told him of. He verified its existence by tossing a handful of dirt and observing the pattern of its fall into the depths. It guided around one section. Had he known of this on the way over, but of course that was a thing about information. Without it, a person suffered enormous complications. Who would have thought there was an invisible bridge all the way across? Yet his long detour had not been an entire loss. He had participated in the rape hearing, and held the shade, and witnessed some fantastic illusions, and rescued Crombie the soldier, and generally learned a lot more about the land of Xanth. He wouldn't care to do it all over again, but the experience had made him grow. He stepped out onto the bridge. There was one thing about it the magician had warned him. Once he started across, he could not turn back, or it would dematerialize, dropping him into the chasm. It was a one-way ramp existing only ahead of him. So he walked across boldly, though the gulf opened out awesomely beneath him. Only his hand on the invisible rail reassured him. He did risk a look down. Here, the base of the chasm was extremely narrow, a virtual crack rather than a valley. The gap dragon could not run here, but there seemed to be no way to climb down this steep cliff slope. If the fall did not kill a person, starvation and exposure would, unless he managed to straddle the narrowest part of the crack and walk east or west to a better section, where the dragon could then catch him. Bink made it across. All it took was knowledge and confidence. His feet safely on land, he looked back. There was no sign of the bridge, of course, and no obvious approach to it. He was not about to risk another crossing. The nervous release left him thirsty. He saw a spring to one side of the path. The path? There had been none a moment ago. He looked back towards the chasm, and there was no path. Oh, it led away from the bridge, not towards it. Routine one-way magic. He proceeded to the spring. He had water in his canteen, but it was spring of life water, which he avoided drinking, saving it for some future emergency. A driblet of water emerged from the spring to flow along a winding channel and finally trickled down into the chasm. The channel was richly overgrown with strange plants, species that Bink had never observed before. A strawberry runner bearing beech nuts, and ferns with deciduous leaves. Odd, but no threat to his welfare. Bink looked around carefully for predator beasts that might lurk near a waterhole, then lay down to put his mouth to the waiting pool. As he lowered his head, he heard a fluting cry above him. "You'll be sorry," it seemed to say. He glanced up into the trees. A bird-like thing perched there, possibly a variety of harpy. She had full woman breasts and a coiled snake tail. Nothing to concern him, so long as she kept her distance. He bent his head again, and heard a rustle, too close. He jumped up, drew his knife, moved a few paces, and through the trees sighted an incredible thing. Two creatures were locked in combat, a griffin and a unicorn. One was male, the other female, and they were not fighting. Bink retreated, profoundly embarrassed. They were two different species. How could they? Disgusted, he returned to the spring. Now he noted the recent tracks of the creatures. Both unicorn and griffin had come to drink here, probably within the hour. Maybe they had crossed the invisible bridge as he had, and seen the spring so conveniently located. So the water could hardly be poisoned. Suddenly he caught on. This was a love spring. Anyone who drank of this water would become compellingly enamored of the first creature he encountered thereafter, and He glanced over at the griffin and unicorn. They were still at it, insatiably. Bink backed away from the spring. If he had drunk from it, he shuddered. He was no longer remotely thirsty. Aw, go take a drink, the harpy fluted. Bink swept up a rock and hurled it at her. She squawked and fluttered higher, laughing coarsely. One of her droppings just missed him. There was nothing more hateful than a harpy. Well, the good magician had warned him that the path home was not entirely free of problems. This spring must be one of the details Humphrey hadn't thought important enough for specific mention. Once Bink was back on the trail along Once Bink was back on the trail along which he had originally come, the hazards would be familiar, such as the peace pines. How would he get through them? He needed an enemy to travel with, and he had none. Then he had a bright idea. Hey, you! Bird brain, he called up into the foliage. Stay away from me or I'll stuff your tail down your filthy throat. The harpy responded with a withering torrent of abuse. What a vocabulary she had. Bink threw another rock at her. I'm warning you, don't follow me, he cried. I'll follow you to the edge of the shield itself, she screeched. You'll never get rid of me. Bink smiled privately. Now he had a suitable companion. He hiked on, dodging the occasional droppings the harpy hurled at him, hoping her fury would carry her through the pines. After that, well, first things first. Soon the path merged with the one he had taken south. Curious, he sighted along the main path both ways. It was visible north and south. He looked back the way he had just come, and there was only deep forest. He took a step back along where he knew he had passed, and found himself knee-deep in glowbriars. The weeds sparkled as they snagged on his legs, and only by maneuvering with extreme caution did he manage to extricate himself without getting scratched. The harpy laughed so hard she almost fell from her perch. There was simply no path here, this direction, but the moment he faced about again, there it was, leading cleanly through the briars to join the main route. Oh well, why did he even bother to question such things? Magic was magic. It had no rationale except its own. Everyone knew that. Everyone except himself at times. He hiked all day, passing the brook where to drink was to become a fish. Have a drink, harpy! But she already knew of the enchantment and reviled him with double fury. The peace pines. Have a nap, harpy! And the trench with the nickelpedes. I'll fetch you something to eat, harpy! But actually he used the repellent the good magician had provided, and never even saw a nickelpede. At last he stopped at a farmhouse in the centaur territory for the night. The harpy finally gave up her chase. She dared not come within range of a centaur bow. These were older centaurs, unaggressive, interested in the news of the day. They listened avidly to the narration of his experiences across the chasm, and considered this to suffice for his room and board. Their grandchild Colt was staying with them, a happy-go-lucky, prancing tyke of barely 25 years. Bink's age, but equivalent to a quarter that in human terms. Bink played with him and did handstands for him. That was a trick no centaur could do, and the Colt was fascinated. Next day he traveled north again, and there was no sign of the harpy. What a relief. He would almost have preferred to risk the peace pines alone. His ears felt indelibly soiled after the day of her expletive. He passed through the remainder of the centaur area without encountering anyone. As evening approached, he reached the north village. Hey, the spellless wonder is back, Zink cried. A hole appeared at Bink's feet, causing him to stumble involuntarily. Zink would have made a wonderful companion for the pines. Bink ignored the other holes and proceeded towards his house. He was back, all right. Why had he bothered to hurry? The examination was held the next morning in the outdoor amphitheater. The royal palms formed colonnades setting off the stage area. The benches were formed from the projecting convoluted knees of a giant dryland cypress tree. The back was braced by 4 huge honey maple trees. Bink had always liked this formation, but now it was a place of discomfort, his place of trial. The old king presided, since this was one of his royal offices. He wore his jewel-encrusted royal robe and his handsome gold crown, and carried the ornate scepter, symbols of his power. All citizens bowed as the fanfare sounded. Bink could not help feeling a shiver of awe as the panoply of royal, but Bink could not help feeling a shiver of awe as the panoply of royalty manifested. The king had an impressive white mane and a long beard, but his eyes tended to drift aimlessly. Periodically, a servitor would nudge him to prevent him from falling asleep and to remind him of the ritual. At the start, the king performed his ceremonial magic by generating a storm. He held his palsied hands high and mumbled his invocation. At first, there was silence. Then, just as it seemed the magic had failed entirely, a ghostly gust of wind passed through the glade, stirring up a handful of leaves. No one said anything, though it was evident that this manifestation could have been mere coincidence. It was certainly a far cry from a storm. But several of the ladies dutifully put up umbrellas, and the master of ceremonies quickly proceeded to the business at hand. Bink's parents, Roland and Bianca, were in the front row, and so was Sabrina, fully as lovely as he had remembered her. Roland caught Bink's eye and nodded encouragingly, and Bianca's gaze was moist, but Sabrina's eyes were downcast. They were all afraid for him. With reason, he thought. "What talent do you proffer to justify your citizenship?" the master of ceremonies asked Bink. He was Munley, a friend of Roland's. Bink knew the man would do everything he could to help, but he was duty-bound to follow the forms. Now it was upon him. I can't show it," Bink said, "but I have the good magician Humphrey's note that I do have magic." He held out the note with a trembling hand. The man took it, glanced at it, and passed it to the king. The king squinted, but his eyes were so watery that he evidently could not read it. "As your majesty can see," Munley murmured discreetly, it is a message from magician Humphrey, bearing his magic seal." This was a picture of a flippered creature balancing a ball on its snout. "It states that this person possesses an undefined magical talent." Something like fire lighted the old monarch's ashy eye momentarily. "This counts for naught," he mumbled. "Humphrey is not king, I am." He let the paper drop to the ground. "But," Bink protested. The master of ceremonies glanced at him warningly, and Bink knew it was hopeless. The king was foolishly jealous of the magician Humphrey, whose power was still strong, and would not heed the message. But, for whatever reason, the king had spoken. Argument would only complicate things. Then he had an idea. "I have brought the king a present," Bink said. "Water from a healing spring." Munley's eyes lighted. "You have magic water?" He was alert to the possibilities of a fully functional king. In my canteen," Bink said. "I saved it. See, it healed my lost finger." He held up his left hand. "It also cured my cold, and I saw it help other people. It heals anything, instantly." He decided not to mention the attached obligation. Munley's talent was the conjuration of small objects. "With your permission?" "Granted," Bink said quickly. The canteen appeared in the man's hand. "This is it?" Yes, for the first time, Bink had real hope. Munley approached the king again. "Bink has brought a gift for your majesty," he announced. "Magic water." The king took the canteen. "Magic water?" he repeated, hardly seeming to comprehend. "It heals all ills," Munley assured him. The king looked at it. One swallow and he would be able to read the magician's message, to brew decent storms again, and to make sensible judgments. This could reverse the course of Bink's demonstration. "You imply I am sick?" the king demanded. "I need no healing. I am as fit as I ever was." And he turned the canteen upside down, letting the precious fluid pour out on the ground. It was as if Bink's life's blood were spilling out, not mere water. He saw his last chance ruined by the very senility he had thought to alleviate. On top of that, now he had no healing water for his own emergencies. He could not be cured again. Was this the retribution of the spring of life for his defiance of it, to tempt him with incipient victory, then withdraw it at the critical moment? Regardless, he was lost. Munley knew it too. He stooped to pick up the canteen, and it vanished from his hand, returned to Bink's house. I am sorry, he muttered under his breath. Then, loudly, demonstrate your talent. Bink tried. He concentrated, willing his magic, whatever it might be, to break its guise and manifest, somehow. But nothing happened. He heard a sob. Sabrina? No, it was his mother, Bianca. Roland sat with stony face, refusing, by his code of honor, to let personal interest interfere. Sabrina still would not look at him. But there were those who did. Zinc, Jams, and Potiphar were all smirking. Now they had reason to feel superior. None of them were spellless wonders. I cannot, Bink whispered. It was over. Again he hiked. This time he headed westward towards the isthmus. He carried a new staff and a hatchet and his knife, and his canteen had been refilled with conventional water. Bianca had provided more excellent sandwiches, flavored by her tears. He had nothing from Sabrina. He had not seen her at all since the decision. Xanth law did not permit an exile to take more than he could conveniently carry, and no valuables for fear of attracting unwanted attention from the mundanes. Though the shield protected Xanth, it was impossible to be too safe. Bink's life was essentially over, for he had been exiled from all that he had known. He was, in effect, an orphan. Never again would he experience the marvels of magic. He would be forever bound, as it were, to the ground, the colorless society of Mundania. Should he have accepted the offer of the sorceress Iris, at least he could have remained in Xanth. Had he but known, he would not have changed his mind. What was right, and wrong was wrong. The strangest thing was that he did not feel entirely despondent. He had lost citizenship, family, and fiancé, and faced the great unknown of the outside. Yet there was a certain quixotic spring to his step. Was it a counter-reaction, buoying his spirits so that he would not suicide, or was he in fact believed that the decision had at last been made? He had been a freak among the magic people. Now he would be among his own kind. No, that wasn't it. He had magic. He was no freak. Strong magic. Magician caliber. Humphrey had told him so, and he believed it. He merely was unable to utilize it. Like a man who could make a colored spot on the wall when there was no wall handy. Why he should be magically mute he did not know, but it meant that he was right, the decision of the king wrong, those who had not stood by him were better off apart from him. No, not that either. His parents had refused to compromise the law of Xanth. They were good, honest people, and Bink shared their values. He had refused a similar compromise when tempted by the sorceress. Roland and Bianca could not help him by accompanying him into exile they did not deserve, or by trying to help him stay by cheating the system. They had done what they felt was right, at great personal sacrifice, and he was proud of them. He knew they loved him, but had let him go his own way without interference. That was part of his buried joy. And Sabrina? What then of her? She too had refused to cheat, yet he felt she lacked the commitment of his parents to principle. She would have cheated had she had sufficient reason. Her surface integrity was because she had not been moved strongly by Bink's misfortune. Her love had not been deep enough. She had loved him for the magic talent she had been convinced she had, as the son of strong, talented parents. The loss of that potential talent had undercut that love. She had not really wanted him as a person. And his love for her was now revealed as similarly shallow. Sure, she was beautiful, but she had less actual personality than, say, the girl D. D had walked off because she had been insulted and stuck by her decision. Sabrina would do the same, but for a different reason. D had not been posturing, she had really been angry. With Sabrina, it would have been more contrived, with more art and less emotion. Because she had less emotion, she cared more about appearances than the reality. Which reminded Bink of the sorceress Iris again, the ultimate creature of appearances. What a temper she had! Bink respected temper. It was a window to the truth at times when little else offered. But Iris was too violent. That palace destruction scene, complete with the storm and dragon. Even stupid what's-her-name, the lovely girl of the rape hearing, Win, that was her name, she had feelings. He hoped, enabled her to escape from the Gap Dragon. There had not been much artifice in her, but Sabrina was the perfect actress, and so he had never really been sure of her love. She had been a picture in his mind to be summoned in times of need just to look at. He had not actually wanted to marry her. It had taken exile to show him his own motives. Whatever it was that he wanted in a girl, ultimately, Sabrina lacked. She had beauty, which he liked, and personality, which was not the same as character, and attractive magic. All these things were good, very good, and he had thought he loved her. But when the crisis came, Sabrina's eyes had been averted. That said it all. Crombie had spoken truly. Bink would have been a fool to marry Sabrina. Bink smiled. How would Crombie and Sabrina have gotten along together? The ultimately demanding and suspicious male, the ultimately artful and protean female. Would the soldier's inherent ferocity constitute a challenge to the girl's power of accommodation? Would they, after all, have fashioned an enduring relationship? It almost seemed they might. They would either have an immediate and violent falling out or a similarly spectacular falling in. Too bad they couldn't meet, and that he could not be present to observe such a meeting. The whole of his Xanth experience was passing glibly through his mind now that he was through with it. For the first time in his life, Bink was free. He no longer needed magic. He no longer needed romance. He no longer needed Xanth. His aimless roving eye spotted a tiny dark spot on a tree. He experienced a sudden shudder. Was it a wiggle wound? No, just a discoloration. He felt relief and realized that he had been fooling himself, at least to this extent. If he no longer needed Xanth, he would not care about such things like the wiggles. He did need Xanth. It was his youth, but he could not have it. Then he approached the station of the shield man, and his uncertainty increased. Once he passed through the shield, Xanth and all its works would be forever behind him. "What are you up to?" the shield man asked him. He was a big, fat youth with pale features, but he was part of the vital net of magic that formed the barrier to outside penetration of Xanth. No living creature could pass the shield either way, but since no inhabitant of Xanth wanted to depart, its net effect was to stop all mundane intrusions. The touch of the shield meant death, instant, painless, final. Bink didn't know how it worked, but he didn't know how any magic worked, really. It just was. "I have been exiled," Bink said. "You have to let me through the shield." He would not, of course, attempt to cheat. He would leave, as directed. Had he been inclined to try to avoid exile, it would not have worked. One villager's talent was spot location of individuals, and he was now tuned to Bink. He would know if Bink remained on this side of the shield today. The youth sighed. "Why do all complications have to come in my shift? Do you know how difficult it is to open up a man-sized hole without bollocksing the whole damn shield?" "I don't know anything about the shield," Bink admitted, "but I was exiled by the king, so—" "Oh, very well. Now look, I can't go with you to the shield. I have to stay here at my station, but I can make an opening spell that will cancel out one section for 5 seconds. You be there and you step through on schedule before it closes on you." Scratch that. "You be there and you step through on schedule, because if it closes on you, you're dead." Bink gulped. For all his thoughts about death and exile, now that it had come to the test, he did want to live. "I know." "Right. The magic stone doesn't care who dies." Meaningfully, the youth tapped the boulder he leaned against. You mean that dingy old stone is it?" Bink asked. "Shield stone, sure. The magician Ebnes located it nearly a century ago and tuned it to form the shield. Without it, we'd still be subject to invasion by the mundanes." Bink had heard of the magician Ebnes, one of the great historical figures, In fact, Abnaz was in Bink's family tree. He had been able to adapt things magically. In his hands, a hammer could become a sledgehammer, or a piece of wood could become a section of window frame. Whatever existed became whatever was needed, within certain limits. He could not adapt air into food, for example, or make a suit of clothing out of water, but it had been amazing what he could do. So he had adapted a potent death stone into the shield stone, killing at a set distance instead of up close, and thereby he had fashioned the salvation of Xanth. What a proud achievement. Okay now, the youth said, here's a time stone. He tapped it against the larger rock, and the small piece fractured into two segments, each fading from the original red to white. He handed one fragment to Bink. When this goes red, you step across. They're synced. The opening will be right in front of the big beech nut tree, and only for 5 seconds. So you be ready and move on red. Move on red, Bink agreed. Right, now move! Sometimes these time stones heal fast. I'll be watching mine so as to time the spell. You watch yours. Bink moved. He ran along the path to the west. Usually, a fractured time stone took half an hour or so to heal, but it varied somewhat with the quality of the stone, the surrounding temperature, and assorted unknown factors. Maybe it was inherent to the original piece, because the two fragments always changed color together, precisely, even if one were in the sunshine and the other buried in a well. But, again, what use to seek a rationale for magic? What was, and would be no more, for him. None of this had meaning in Mundania. He hove in sight of the shield, or rather, its effect. The shield itself was invisible, but there was a line of dead vegetation where it touched the ground, and the corpses of animals that had been so foolish as to cross that line. Sometimes Jump Deer got confused and sprang through to the safe ground on the other side, but they were already dead. The shield was invisibly thin, but absolute. Occasionally, mundane creatures blundered into it. A detail walked the line each day on the Xanth side, checking for corpses, hauling them out of the shield when they were partway across, giving them safe burial. It was possible to handle something that lay across the shield, so long as the living person did not touch it himself. Nevertheless, it was a grisly chore, sometimes assigned as punishment. There were never any human mundanes, but there was always the fear that there might one day be some, with all the complications that would entail. Ahead was the spreading beechnut tree. One branch reached out towards the shield, and the tip of that branch was dead. Wind must have made its way across. It helped identify the spot where he should cross. There was an odor associated with this line of death, too. Probably it was the decay of many tiny creatures, worms in the earth, bugs flying through the shield, rotting where they fell. This was the region of death. Bink glanced down at the stone he held, and sucked in his breath in shock. It was red. Had it just now changed, or was he already too late? His life depended on the answer. He launched himself at the shield. He knew the sensible thing to do was return to the shield tender and explain why he had balked, but he wanted this done with. Maybe it had been the actual change of the stone's color that had attracted his attention, in which case he did have time, so he took the foolish course and tried for it. 1 second. 2. 3. He better have the whole 5, because he wasn't there yet. The shield seemed close, but it took time to make the supposedly instant decision and abolish inertia and get up to speed. He was passing the beechnut tree at a dead run, maybe literally dead, going too fast to stop. 4 seconds. He was crossing the line of death. If it closed on his trailing leg, would all of him die or just the leg? 5. He felt a tingle. 6. No, time was up. Stop counting, start panting. He was through. Was he alive? He rolled in the dirt, kicking up dry leaves and small bones. Of course he was alive. How could he worry about it otherwise? As with the Manticora, concerned about his soul. If he had none, he wouldn't. Bink sat up, shaking something dead out of his hair. So he had made it. That tingle must have been an effect of the turned-off shield, since it hadn't hurt him. Now it was done. He was free of Xanth forever, free to make his own life without being ridiculed, or mothered or tempted, free to be himself. Bink put his face in his hands and cried.